The NHL offseason is right around the corner, and with that comes a ton of speculation about the potential of players being traded to different teams. Now, there's a ton of players who either are going to be traded this year based on performance or just simply salary cap issues. And today, I'm going to be going through 10 different players who I feel are going to get traded this offseason and where I think they should end up if they are moved on from their team. So if you guys have been liking the content lately, make sure you hit that subscribe button now, and let's get right into this one. Now, before we get started with this video, there is one trade that actually ended up happening yesterday, and that was the Jakob Markstrom to the New Jersey Devils deal. So before I get into that one, just know that I predicted it pretty accurately here, but just wanted to let you guys know that it wasn't a mistake. The recording just happened before. So let's get right into this one. Let's start with the first guy on my list, a goalie in Linus Ullmark. Now, we all know that the Boston Bruins have had the best goaltending tandem over the past 2 seasons, but with Jeremy Swayman stepping up and becoming the true number 1 option for Boston, it just feels like it's time for the team to move on from this tandem. And with Linus Ullmark only having 1 year left on his deal, around $5 million, it just makes sense for Boston to move on from this player in order to get a few pieces that they need, such as center and defense, in order to prepare for next season. So I could see the Boston Bruins potentially moving on from Ullmark this offseason, and I think the perfect place for him to go would be the Ottawa Senators. For Ullmark, it seems like geography is a big thing when it comes to him being traded, and for him to go to another place, he has to approve of it thanks to his no move clause. So I feel like with the Ottawa Senators having some lackluster goaltending performances this year, Ullmark would slide in perfectly with that group and provide a much more stable presence in net, something that Ottawa has lacked for years now. I do think that Ottawa is going to have to pony up something pretty big in order to acquire Ullmark, considering he's the best goalie on the market. But if Boston does decide to move on from one of their 2 guys, I feel like Ullmark is the one, and moving him to Ottawa would make a lot of sense. Next up, we have another goalie, but coming from the Nashville Predators in Juuse Saros. Now, Saros has been in every trade rumor since the deadline, and the Preds decided to hang on to him and make the postseason run kind of interesting this year. But after being bounced in the first round and Saros only having 1 year left on his deal, it feels like now's the perfect opportunity for them to move on from this player, especially when they have a young up-and-coming goalie in their farm system who's ready to take the net. For Saros to be moved, I feel like Nashville's going to get a pretty big package, and I feel like sending him to the Toronto Maple Leafs would be the perfect option. Now, what they get back, I'm not too sure. I feel like there's a potential opportunity for them to trade for one of the core 4 in this type of deal, but regardless, I feel like this would be the perfect answer for Toronto. Get a consistent guy in net to replace Samsonov, since he's probably not going to come back next year, and move forward knowing that you're going to have a good presence in net for you when you enter the postseason next season. Next up, we have the third goalie on my list coming from the Calgary Flames in Jakob Markstrom. Arguably one of the more consistent guys across the league, despite playing on a very, very bad Calgary Flames team this year. I think it's the perfect time for the Flames to move on from this player, especially while he's still playing at his peak. Now, the Flames did entertain the possibility of moving him to the New Jersey Devils at the deadline, but this fell through for whatever reason. But with the Devils missing the playoffs in a season that was sort of underwhelming for the organization, I feel like this is the perfect time for them to revisit this trade and acquire a guy like Markstrom. Now, the Devils have a ton of young players and draft picks that they could send back to Calgary, making this an appealing trade for both sides. And I just feel like for the Devils to get back in contention, they need to make a big swing on a goaltender, because that was their biggest Achilles heel last season. And if they run it back with Jake Allen, I could see them missing the playoffs again. Next up, this was kind of talked about in my Saros trade. I have Mitch Marner being traded from the Toronto Maple Leafs. And this is solely because I feel like Marner's going to want more on his next contract, and I just don't think that Toronto can afford it based on the needs that they're going to have this offseason. So like I was talking about with Saros earlier, I see a potential trade going down with Nashville and Toronto, sending Mitch Marner back in that deal for Saros, along with something else coming over from the Nashville Predators, because I do think that Marner has a higher value than Saros right now. But sending Marner to the Nashville Predators, placing him on a team with guys like O'Reilly as well as Forsberg, I feel like he could really be a great addition to that Predator squad and kind of speed up the soft rebuild that team's going through, and sort of develop his new personality playing with a team that is much more underappreciated than the Toronto Maple Leafs. So I see Mitch Marner getting traded, and I think the perfect spot for him to land would be the Nashville Predators. He could re-sign, get a big contract, since that team doesn't really have a ton of stars that are making a ton of money on that team, and I think it would just be a perfect spot for him and Saros in a deal. Next up, we have a guy coming from California in Trevor Zegras. I feel like at this point, with the injury history that he has and all of the talented forwards that the Ducks have in their farm system, there could be an opportunity for them to beef up their defense by trading one of these players. And with Trevor Zegras' injury history, I feel like at this point you could sell pretty high on him, sending him to a team like Montreal, who seems like they have a ton of interest in the young forward. Trevor Zegras is flashy. He has a lot of name and brand power. So sending him to a team like Montreal, an original six franchise who could make him the face of the organization, would be a perfect deal for Montreal, sending a guy like Ryan Backer back to help the Ducks with their defensive unit. I think this would work out perfectly for the Ducks, but if he doesn't get traded, I don't think it's a bad thing either. He's on a pretty good contract, so whatever team decides to trade for him, or if the Ducks decide to keep him, I do think he's going to be more value than what he's earning on that deal. Next up is sort of some recent news that broke. Patrik Laine reportedly requested a trade from the Columbus Blue Jackets, looking for a fresh start. And I feel like this is the perfect opportunity for Patrik Laine to just get himself back on track. Earlier in the season, he entered the player assistance program, and with the current contract that he's on and his injury history, I feel like a deal like this is going to be very difficult for Columbus to find. Now, there's few teams who I feel like they could seamlessly trade with Laine's contract being the way it is, and that's the Chicago Blackhawks and San Jose Sharks. And I feel like the Chicago Blackhawks would just be the perfect place for him to land. They just got generational talent Connor Bedard, and they're trying to surround him with some players who, you know, can maybe make his game a little bit more sound and kind of teach him the ways of the NHL. And I'm not saying that Patrik Laine is going to be some kind of mentor for Connor Bedard, but Laine is only around 25, 26 years old, and he is a very good goal scorer. And we all know that Chicago has the cap space. It's not like they would struggle at all acquiring him. They have the assets, they have the young players, and I feel like this would be a good fresh start for Laine to be sent to in order to kind of get his career just back on track. This next one kind of circles back to a trade that I was talking about earlier with Linus Ullmark, and that's Jakob Chychrun of the Ottawa Senators. Now, if Boston does send Ullmark to Ottawa, I feel like the perfect return for them would be Jakob Chychrun. And you might be asking yourself, well, doesn't Boston already have a good defensive unit, and don't they need centers more than they need defensemen? And yeah, they do need a center, but Boston's going to have more cap space to work with this. And trading a guy like Ullmark for Chychrun is basically just going to wash out their salaries, but give Boston a much needed defenseman for their top four rather than just having a elite second goalie on their lineup. I do think Jakob Chychrun would be the perfect fit with Boston. They need a top four defenseman. Ottawa needs a top goalie, and you could basically go 1-for-1 with this one. Some people might be saying that Ullmark's going to command more than just one player, but I do feel like this would be a pretty fair trade for both parties. Next up is another goalie, and what can I say? There's a ton of them on this list, but this one is again from the Columbus Blue Jackets in Elvis Merzlikins. Now, a big thing when it comes to Merzlikins is not just his play, because I feel like we all know he's very talented and that his play will probably pick up depending on what team he plays on next, but it's really just his contract. He's making over $5 million, and there's a lot of term left on this. So for somebody to trade for Merzlikins, they're going to kind of have to give up a lot to acquire him. But there's one team that I feel like would actually be a great spot for him to land, and that's the Detroit Red Wings. They had a ton of goaltending drama this year with Lyon, Reimer, and Husso. None of them seem like they're going to be the future for the Wings organization. So I feel like potentially making a swing with Columbus, sending one of those three guys back to acquire Merzlikins, could be a move for the Detroit Red Wings to build off of. They do have a young, promising defensive unit, and with Merzlikins sliding in net, I feel like they could get a big uptake in goaltending performance this year just by that one move. Like I said, it is a bit risky. It's a high contract and does have a lot of length left, but I feel like this could be something that could be beneficial to the Wings next season if they decided to pull the trigger on a goalie. This next one's kind of a 2-for-1. I have Pavel Buchnevich and John Gibson both heading to the Carolina Hurricanes. With Gibson making kind of a big contract right now, I do feel this one's kind of a stretch, but I think that the Carolina Hurricanes window, it's going to close eventually, and if you're not going to make a big swing at a goaltender and just continue to rely on Frederik Andersen, who really just hasn't proven himself in the playoffs, I feel like that's just going to be a big mistake for the team moving forward. Now, there's a ton of goalies on the market this offseason potentially, so this isn't the only guy they could go for, but I like the fit of Gibson in Carolina. I think think he's steady. He could be consistent for the Canes, and with that defensive unit, I think he would play some of his best hockey of his career there. As well as Pavel Buchnevich just being a great addition to that team. I've seen so many reports of him being interested in going there if he's traded, and I do feel that he would be a great fit for that Carolina culture, adding to that team and making sure that they are able to get over the hump next season. But these are the top 10 potential trades that I could see happening this NHL offseason, and where I think some of these players would land if they are traded. Let me know what you guys think about all of this, if you think I got some of the destinations right, or if you think that any of these guys are actually going to be moved, or if you think they're just going to stay with their teams. Comment your thoughts as always below. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next one.